Alright guys, in this video we are going to review Standard 1 of U.S. History. So if you think back, that is the colonial period. We're talking about the 13 colonies, okay? So we have those three distinct regions of colonial settlement. We have in red the New England region. That was the colonies of Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. Then we have the middle colonies in pink, which were New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. And then lastly, the southern colonies in yellow, the ones we are most familiar with because this is our present day area. Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, okay? So when you think back to these three regions, I really want you to focus on making sure you remember which ones are sort of the epitome of their region. So in New England, Massachusetts sort of best summed up the New England colonies. Whereas in the middle colonies, Pennsylvania was really sort of the epitome of the middle colonies. And then in the South, Virginia was sort of the best example of what the southern colonies looked like. Alright, so we're going to dive into the southern colonies first. And if you notice, I have Virginia highlighted because, again, that was sort of the epitome of the southern colonies, okay? So the first successful settlement in America was Jamestown, Virginia in 1607. And remember, that was funded by a joint stock company, the Virginia Company. Okay, that's why it was named Virginia. The colony was ultimately saved when John Rolfe discovered tobacco and that it grew well in the region. And remember, that sort of gave way to the headright system, which was where they promised 50 acres of land to any new settlers that would come over into the colony, okay? Now, the southern economy, how did they function, their money? That's what we're talking about when we talk about the economy, okay? Staple crops were a big part of the South, all right? They were the crops that were in large demand and what really provided most of the income in this region, okay? Initially, we're talking about tobacco, and later on, you're going to see rice sort of explode in the South. All right, that gave way to the plantation system, which, remember, are those large farms that were owned by the wealthy that required a lot of manual labor, okay? At first, we had indentured servants that were doing that labor. And remember, those were the people who agreed to work for the landowner for a period of 7 years in exchange for the landowner paying for their trip to America, okay? But remember, that eventually turned into the system of slavery, okay? And remember, slaves were considered property, they weren't going to get their freedom back, okay? All right, looking at the southern colonies continued their society, okay? Remember, they had that class system. And if you look over here, this is sort of that social pyramid, all right? You have those rich landowners or the gentry class at the top of the pyramid. The poor farmers were just below it, and then at the bottom were the slaves, okay? And remember, this is in the South that we're talking about, okay? Remember, they also did not have any public education. If you were a part of this rich landowning gentry class, you might send your kids to England or to maybe up north for some education, but generally there was no public education for everyone, okay? It was just only those rich people that could afford it. In terms of religion, we see that rich landowners tended to remain part of the Church of England, and that was because it was in their best political and economic interests, okay? Remember, guys, they are relying on those staple crops and the money that they're getting from those staple crops. Therefore, they're not going to mess with their consumers of those products, okay? So they tended to remain part of the Church of England. Look, I put it down here again. Remember, southern colonies were established primarily for economic reasons, okay? They were where the money was being made. All right, now moving on to the New England colonies, okay, guys? Those were primarily settled by those people who were unhappy with the Church of England, okay? And if you notice, I also have Massachusetts highlighted here because that is the epitome of the New England colonies, okay? The people that settled in these regions are what we refer to as Puritans. And remember, they wanted to establish that city upon a hill. And that was Plymouth, Massachusetts is particularly the region that we're talking about, okay? In the New England economy, they relied heavily on shipbuilding, trade, and fishing, remember, because they were close to the Atlantic Ocean. They had those ports, okay? They had some farming, or some farm, I'm sorry, that shouldn't say farming, it should say farms. They had some farms, but they were very much smaller than those in the South, okay? Boston, Massachusetts was a big commerce hub for this region, okay? The New England colonies continued. If you notice, I put a little map up here for you. All right, in terms of their society, the Puritan church was a central part of life in New England. Dissenters were banished from the colony. If you didn't, it was their way or the highway, okay? Remember, we talked about the incident with the Salem witch trials, and that was when they accused women in the colony of being possessed by the devil or of witchcraft, and many of those were tried and killed eventually, okay? They were the first to promote public education in New England, okay, guys? Remember, New England was primarily established for religious purposes. They thought that everyone should be able to read the Bible, and therefore they thought public education was important because if you didn't have an education, you couldn't read the Bible, okay? They only had boys attend school at first. And remember, eventually, this is where we see those colleges pop up, okay? Remember, they're promoting public education, and then we have those colleges, Harvard and Yale, that were established, right? And we know those are still in the New England region today, okay? Remember the purpose of these colleges of Harvard and Yale when they were first established in this time period were to train ministers and priests, again, because they thought that everyone should read the Bible, and they were very heavily focused on religion, okay? All right, moving on to the middle colonies, okay? And if you notice, there's a map over here of them as well. They were the most culturally diverse region, okay? This was because of their location and their religious tolerance, okay? We talked about in the New England colonies, it was either their way or the highway. Well, when you took the highway, you typically wound up in the middle colonies, okay? Because they were so much more tolerant. We're going to talk about that in a minute, okay? Their economy, they depended on farming and commerce. So they're sort of the mix of the New England region and the South, okay? They had farms where they grew typically wheat, barley, and rice. Those were their sort of staple crops. And then in terms of commerce, they had the port cities of New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore, where they relied on shipping, and they had those big urban centers for trade, okay? Although you did have slaves in the middle colonies, they were nowhere near as numerous as they had been in the South. And then also the middle colonies, you see a lot more of the fur trade happening there, okay? So middle colonies continued, guys. In terms of society, William Penn, right here for you, created Pennsylvania as a homeland for the Quakers. You'll also see Quaker oats right here, right? Do you see the resemblance here? It'll make you think of that. So he created Pennsylvania as a homeland for the Quakers and thus religious tolerance, okay? The Quakers did not recognize class differences, and they also promoted equality of the sexes, practiced pacifism or nonviolence, and treated Native Americans fairly, okay, guys? Because they were such tolerant and peaceful people, all of those people that had sort of been banished from New England, or all of those people coming in from other countries, tended to settle in this region, okay, because they were more accepting. Thus, you have an influx of migrants, like I said here, and in this region, Philadelphia actually became the largest city. All right, colonial government. Okay, so we have first and foremost the policy of salutary neglect is sort of what we see at first in the colonies, okay? And remember, that's when the English government pretty much let the colonies rule themselves, okay? That's what we call that form of government, you would say, okay? And then we have representative governments where people elected their own officials, okay? Governors later were appointed by the crown at that time, or New England. When I say the crown, I'm talking about England, okay? So you had representative governments that were established where people elected their own officials, but then you also had the governors that were appointed by the crown, okay? However, colonial legislatures came to possess most of the power in that region, okay? Again, moving back, we have the Mayflower Compact, which were the first efforts at self-government, okay? And that's saying the power is coming from the people, okay? We are granting this government permission to rule over us, okay? Or this system of government. Then we have the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut that were established, and that said government's powers only come from the free consent of the people, or our will to let it rule us. And that set limits on what the government could do, ultimately, okay? And guys, these are all little pieces of this colonial government that were established, and we're going to see how that sort of forms into the shaping of our government later on. All right, so in terms of women and African Americans, okay, we see women were typically treated as second-class citizens in the colonial times, and African Americans, guys, they first arrived in 1619 in Jamestown. A lot of them initially arrived as indentured servants, but again, we know that that system sort of gave way into slavery, okay? All right, so foundations of our representative government, all right? First and foremost, we have the concept of limited government that we see emerge from this time period, okay? It's exactly what it sounds like, guys. The fact that the government has limits. It can't do anything and everything it wants to, all right? Additionally, we have the rule of law as a foundation for our representative government that it was established during this period. All right, when we say rule of law, we simply mean that governments based on the rule of law have to obey a body of rules, okay? In 1215, we see the Magna Carta emerge, and that was when a group of English nobles forced King John I to sign this, granting nobles various rights, and it prevented him from imposing taxes, or any king, without council, okay? It also established Parliament and the two-house system in England, with an upper chamber called the House of Lords and a lower chamber called the House of Commons, okay? Again, we're going to see all of this feed into what becomes our system of government, okay? And lastly, we have the English Bill of Rights, and that said that the monarch could not interfere with parliamentary elections or impose taxes without consent, that people had the right to a fair and speedy trial, no cruel and unusual punishment, and the right to petition a government, okay? All right, guys. A lot of these ideas also we see at this time period came from the Enlightenment, and specifically we're going to look at the man John Locke over here in the image, okay? He sort of fostered the idea of natural rights, that people have the right to life, liberty, and property, and also social contract theory, which is this concept that there's this contract between the government and the people, and that if the people willingly let the government rule over them, but if the government sort of steps out of line, then the people have the right to overthrow that government if they're not protecting their rights as human beings, okay? So all of those ideas are from this Enlightenment period. Specifically, John Locke is the key figure we look to for those. But also, another part of our foundation for our government today is the idea of self-government and the will of the people. And lastly, Virginia's House of Burgesses. We sort of took a snippet of that as well, okay? And that was our first example of limited self-government. All right, guys. So, now, I know this is coming quick, but just bear with me, okay? Causes of the American Revolution, okay? And these are those lists. If you remember back to earlier in the year, we sort of made this list of things that added to the snowball effect that was the American Revolution, okay? First, we have the Navigation Acts that said the colonies could only sell certain goods to England. Then the French and Indian War. Remember, it's the French and the Indians versus the British, okay? Ultimately, France wound up surrendering land in Canada and all lands east of the Mississippi River, okay? So that sort of made Britain the dominant force in the new America, okay? We have the writs of assistance, which were those general search warrants. We have the proclamation line of 1763 that said no one could settle west of Appalachia. All right, this Appalachian mountain range. The Stamp Act said that all printed materials needed a stamp. Remember, this is where we see the phrase no taxation without representation pop up, okay? And then the Declaratory Act said, look, Parliament has the authority to impose all of these taxes on the colonies, okay? All right, causes of the American Revolution continued. We have the Townshend Acts, okay? Again, I know we're going fast, but just bear with me. The Townshend Acts tax those imported goods like glass and tea, okay? Then we have the Boston Massacre. Then we have the Boston Tea Party, and you guys both know what those things are, okay? And that eventually led to the Coercive or Intolerable Acts, sort of how the British responded to the massacre of the Tea Party and on all the unrest in the colonies at this time. Remember, they closed Boston Harbor, and they placed a military governor in charge of Massachusetts, okay? The people responded with the First Continental Congress, the people of America. And then we see the shots at Lexington and Concord, sort of as it really starting off. Then we have the Second Continental Congress that pretty well continues for the entirety of the Revolution. And then Thomas Paine's Common Sense as some propaganda going on during this time. All right, then we have the Declaration of Independence, okay? It